Angela Simpson. In the summer of 2009, a man in a wheelchair vanished from an assisted living facility in Phoenix, Arizona. 3 days later, firefighters were called out to put out what looked like an ordinary fire in a garbage can behind a small city church. What they pulled out of that garbage can took forensic specialists to identify. And when investigators finally traced the trail back to the woman responsible, she sat across from them with almost no expression and told them she had no regrets about any of it. Her only complaint, she said, was that she was not going to be free to do it again. Angela Simpson was born in November of 1975. By her own account, she had struggled with mental illness since she was around 10 years old, and heavy drug use followed shortly after. Almost nothing else about her early life ever became public. What she left behind, in the summer of 2009, was a crime scene that Phoenix homicide detectives would later describe as one of the most heinous cases their department had ever seen. Her victim was Terry Neely, a 46-year-old paraplegic man who lived at a nearby care facility and moved around the city in a motorized wheelchair. On the 2nd of August, 2009, Simpson approached Neely and offered him drugs. He agreed to follow her back to a vacant apartment she had access to. What happened inside that apartment then stretched over roughly 3 days. Simpson had convinced herself, on almost no evidence, that Terry Neely was a police informant. Acting on that belief, she beat him, stabbed him more than 50 times using several different knives, and drove a 3-inch nail into his skull. When she was finished, she dismembered his remains, moved them across the city to the back of a Phoenix church, placed them inside a metal garbage can, and set the can on fire. Firefighters arrived on the 5th of August to what they thought was a small trash fire. Instead, they found the remains, and Phoenix police were called out within the hour. Fingerprint records identified Terry Neely by the end of the day. An anonymous tip then directed investigators to Neely's abandoned wheelchair, a short distance from a nearby apartment building. Inside that apartment, technicians found blood spatter that DNA testing quickly matched to Neely. Simpson herself was already sitting in a Phoenix holding cell on an unrelated charge. When detectives sat her down and told her what they had, she admitted to all of it. What do you do with a person who admits everything and regrets nothing? For the Maricopa County court system, that question had a single available answer. In March of 2012, Simpson entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder. On the 2nd of April of that same year, Judge Paul McMurdy of Maricopa County Superior Court sentenced her to natural life in the Arizona state prison system, with an additional 14 years attached for the kidnapping and concealment charges. Natural life, under Arizona law, means exactly what the term sounds like. There is no parole date. There is no eligible release under any circumstance. Simpson will remain in prison until she dies there. In the years since her sentencing, Simpson has attracted a kind of attention she never asked for. During a jailhouse interview recorded shortly after her arrest, she told a reporter that she felt no remorse for what she had done to Terry Neely. Her only regret, she said, was that her sentence meant she would never again be free to hunt down what she called snitches. That interview eventually inspired one of the writers behind the television series Killing Eve, and elements of Simpson's flat, unemotional presentation on camera were said to have shaped the fictional character of Villanelle. As of 2026, Angela Simpson is 50 years old. She continues to serve her sentence within the Arizona Department of Correction system, understood to be housed at the State Women's Facility in Perryville. Terry Neely's surviving relatives have never given a public interview about the case. Simpson's crime spanned 3 days and produced a single victim, and even that single act was considered brutal enough to earn her a life without release. But the next name on this list operated for years, spread his crimes across an entire province, and was, by every outward measure, one of the most respected men in his country. Russell Williams. For most of his adult life, the man who commanded Canadian Forces Base Trenton was also the man who flew Queen Elizabeth II on her Canadian tours, transported the Canadian Prime Minister, and carried some of the most senior officials in the country on official state travel. He wore the uniform of a colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He lived quietly with his wife in a small town in eastern Ontario. And when investigators finally walked him into an interrogation room in February of 2010, they walked out of that same room with a confession that reached across more than 80 separate crimes, including 2 murders committed inside the homes of women he had chosen at random. David Russell Williams was born in 1963. He rose through the Royal Canadian Air Force with the kind of career that ends up in academy case studies. By 2009, he had taken command of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the largest Air Force installation in the country and the primary hub for Canadian troop movements overseas. Colleagues described him as disciplined, quiet, and beyond reproach. To the Canadian government, he was one of the most trusted officers in uniform. The hidden life ran underneath all of it. Beginning in 2007, Williams broke into dozens of homes belonging to women and teenage girls near his residences in Ottawa, and later in the small town of Tweed, Ontario. He stole underwear from his victims. He photographed himself wearing it. He documented every entry, every item, every self-portrait, storing thousands of images across multiple personal computers hidden in his own home. By September of 2009, the pattern had escalated. In 2 separate incidents that month, Williams entered women's homes and committed violent sexual assaults. Both victims survived. 2 months later, on the night of the 24th of November, he entered the home of Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 38-year-old flight attendant who served on the base he himself commanded. He took her life inside her own home. He photographed and filmed the assault. Less than 2 months after that, on the night of the 28th of January, 2010, Williams abducted 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd from her home outside Belleville, Ontario. He held her for several days at his lakefront cottage before taking her life and hiding her body in a wooded area. The mistake that ended his double life was almost accidental. On the night Jessica Lloyd disappeared, Ontario Provincial Police set up a roadside canvas on the length of Highway 37, the rural road that ran past her home. Officers photographed the tire treads of every SUV that came through the checkpoint. One of those matches led directly back to a black Nissan Pathfinder registered to Colonel David Russell Williams. He was invited in for what he was told would be a routine interview on the 7th of February, 2010. Over roughly 10 hours, Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the OPP walked Williams through the physical evidence in what would later be studied at police training academies across the world as one of the most effective interrogations ever recorded. Williams confessed. He drew maps to Jessica Lloyd's body. He admitted to the 2 murders, to the 2 September assaults, and to 82 separate break-and-enter offenses. How does a man entrusted with piloting a head of state end up being the man in that interrogation room? That question was never given a satisfying answer. In October of 2010, Williams appeared in a Belleville, Ontario courtroom and pleaded guilty to 88 charges, including the 2 first-degree murder counts. The Crown prosecutor, Lee Burgess, visibly fought back tears while walking the court through what Jessica Lloyd had endured in the final days of her life. Members of the public gallery heard extracts from the videos Williams himself had recorded of both murders. Justice Robert Scott, in delivering the sentence, said that the depths of the depravity Williams had shown were, in his experience on the bench, without equal. Williams was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, along with additional custodial sentences for the sexual assaults and the break-ins. His commission was revoked. His military decorations were formally burned. His uniform was cut apart on official orders. As of 2026, Russell Williams is 63 years old and continues to serve his sentence at Port Cartier Institution, a maximum security federal prison in northern Quebec. His first parole eligibility falls in 2035, though Canadian legal analysts almost unanimously agree he will never be released. The Ontario provincial police officers who worked the case have described the years spent cataloging Williams' photographs and videos as one of the hardest assignments their forensic teams ever undertook. In the years immediately after the conviction, the OPP declined nearly all media requests connected to the case, citing what they called a healing process for the officers involved. Williams was undone by a single traffic canvass at the end of 4 years of secret escalation. But the man who comes next kept his own double life running for closer to 2 decades. And he did it not from behind the walls of a military base, but from behind the anonymous glow of an early internet chat room. John Edward Robinson. In the summer of 2000, cadaver dogs led investigators onto a rural property in eastern Kansas. Behind an outbuilding on that property, officers pulled up 2 industrial 55-gallon chemical drums, sealed shut. Inside them were the remains of 2 women. Days later, when investigators drove across the state line into Missouri and opened a storage unit rented under the same man's name, they found 3 more sealed barrels containing 3 more women. The man who had placed them there was 56 years old, a Kansas grandfather, a former Eagle Scout, and in the 1980s, a local civic organization's Man of the Year. John Edward Robinson Sr. was born in December of 1943 and spent decades constructing a public image as a respectable Kansas businessman. He was married, a father and grandfather, active in his church community, and had once been publicly honored for what was called his service to the community. Under that presentation, he ran fraud schemes, forged legal documents, and, beginning in the mid-1980s, began luring women to their deaths. In the late 1990s, he migrated his hunt onto the early internet, where he became one of the first serial predators known to have used online chat rooms as a tool. Robinson's known victims span roughly 16 years. His first known victim was Paula Godfrey, a young woman who disappeared in 1984 after Robinson had approached her with the offer of a job. In 1985, a woman named Lisa Stasi vanished along with her infant daughter. Stasi's remains were never found. Robinson would later place the infant into what looked, on paper, like a completely legitimate adoption with his own brother, using forged legal documents. That brother went on to raise the little girl for nearly 2 decades, unaware of where she had really come from. Through the 1990s, more women disappeared. Catherine Clampett, Beverly Bonner, whose family Robinson kept convinced she was still alive by intercepting her mail and forging letters in her handwriting for years after her death. A mother and her adult daughter, Sheila and Deborah Faith. And, in the online era, Isabella Lewica and Suzette Troughton, both drawn to Robinson through BDSM chat rooms where he operated under the username Slave Master. Robinson was believed to be responsible for at least 8 murders in total. He was ultimately convicted of 5. The case broke in the spring of 2000, when several women who had survived encounters with Robinson came forward with complaints of sexual battery and theft. Those complaints gave a joint Kansas-Missouri task force the probable cause it needed to search Robinson's property in La Cygne, Kansas. Cadaver dogs led investigators directly behind an outbuilding to the 2 sealed drums. Within days, the storage unit in Raymore, Missouri, produced 3 more. Sergeant Rick Roth of the Lenexa, Kansas Police, one of the officers on scene when the barrels were opened, later said publicly that the smell of decomposition released when they pried open the first drum physically pushed the investigators backward. Roth would go on to describe Robinson as one of the most dangerous criminals he had encountered in his entire career. How does a church-going grandfather in a small Kansas town keep the sealed remains of 5 women in his own backyard and in a rented storage unit for years in plain view of everyone around him? The Kansas trial that followed became the longest criminal proceeding in that state's history. In 2002, Robinson was convicted of the capital murders of Suzette Troughton and Isabella Lewiska, and of the first-degree murder of Lisa Stasi. He was sentenced to death. Rather than face a second trial in Missouri and the possibility of a second death sentence there, Robinson entered a plea agreement across the state line. Under that agreement, he formally confessed to the murders of Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Deborah Faith, and accepted consecutive life sentences that would keep him incarcerated for the remainder of his life, even if the Kansas death sentence were ever overturned on appeal. Since his conviction, Robinson has filed a long series of appeals, all of them denied. The most recent significant filings, made through court-appointed counsel, argued procedural errors during the original 2002 proceedings. Every one of those appeals was rejected. As of 2026, John Edward Robinson is 82 years old and remains on Kansas death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. Kansas has not carried out an execution since 1965, which means that even with his death sentence still in place, Robinson is now understood to be, in practice, serving a life sentence. He is expected to die inside the walls of the institution. Robinson relied on the trust his community placed in him to lure women away from safety. The next man on this list relied on something even simpler: the ordinary, unquestioning trust that a family on vacation places in the person who checks them into their room. Cary Stayner. In February of 1999, 3 tourists checked into a small motel just outside the western entrance to Yosemite National Park. They were a mother, her teenage daughter, and a young family friend visiting from Argentina, all on a sightseeing trip through California. Days later, their rental car was found abandoned on a rural road nearly 100 miles from the park. The mother's remains were inside the trunk. It would take federal investigators 5 long months to accept that the man responsible was not part of the group of suspects the FBI had already publicly named. He was the maintenance handyman who had, at some point, waved goodbye to that same family from the motel parking lot. Cary Stayner was born in 1961 and had spent much of his life in the shadow of his younger brother, Stephen Stayner, whose abduction and eventual escape had become one of the most publicized child cases in American history. Cary worked as a maintenance handyman at Cedar Lodge, a modest motel in the small community of El Portal, California, at the western gateway to Yosemite. To everyone at the lodge, he was quiet, reliable, and unremarkable. He would later admit to investigators that he had been living with violent fantasies about harming women since he was a teenager. On the 15th of February, 1999, Stayner entered a Cedar Lodge room occupied by 3 guests. Carol Sund was 42, a warm mother from Eureka, California. With her was her teenage daughter Julie and a young family friend visiting from Argentina. Stayner bound the 3 of them. He took the lives of Carol and the young family friend inside the room. He then drove the teenage daughter separately to a location near Lake Don Pedro, where he took her life as well. He hid the remains, abandoned the rental car in a remote area, and returned to work at the lodge. The FBI's initial investigation focused on a separate group of men who were already in custody on unrelated charges. In April of that year, the Bureau publicly announced that they believed the people responsible for the Cedar Lodge case had already been identified. That announcement fell apart on the 21st of July, when Stainer harmed fatally a 26-year-old Yosemite naturalist named Joey Ruth Armstrong outside her cabin inside the park itself. This time, a passing witness placed Stainer's vehicle at the scene. Federal agents traced him within days to a nudist resort in Wilton, California, where he had gone after Armstrong's murder. FBI Special Agent Jeffrey Rinnick sat down with him for what was expected, at least on paper, to be a routine conversation. Over roughly 6 hours, Rinnick drew from Stainer a full confession, not only to the murder of Armstrong, but to the 3 Cedar Lodge murders as well. Jeffrey Rinnick would later write about that interview in his own memoir. He described the case as one that broke something in him that never fully healed. In the years afterward, Rinnick publicly disclosed that he had developed post-traumatic stress disorder related to his career interviewing violent offenders, and that he had at one point attempted to take his own life. Stainer, he wrote, was among the interviews he could never fully leave behind. What does it mean to be the person who has to sit across the table from someone like that, hour after hour, and listen to it all? Stainer was tried first in federal court on the charge of murdering Joey Armstrong. He entered a guilty plea in that case and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The state trial for the 3 Cedar Lodge murders followed. On the 27th of August, 2002, a California jury convicted him of all 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. The automatic appeal that California law requires in every capital case then moved through the state courts for more than 2 decades. In the spring of 2026, the California Supreme Court unanimously denied that appeal. The opinion was written by Chief Justice Patricia Guerrero, with Justice Kelly Evans dissenting in part on a limited procedural question. That ruling closed the last major state-level route Stainer had available. As of 2026, Cary Stainer remains under a California death sentence. He is 64 years old. No executions have been carried out in California since 2006, and under the moratorium declared by Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019, no execution is scheduled. The dismantling of San Quentin's death row, which began in early 2024, means Stainer has been transferred from that facility to another maximum security prison, though the California Department of Corrections has not publicly confirmed the location. The Yosemite case is one of the few on this list where a lead investigator has spoken openly and at length about the personal psychological cost of the work. The next case on this list produced a comparable weight on the other side of the Atlantic, in a quiet flat in North London, and it ended the career of the senior detective who worked it. Dennis Nilsen. In February of 1983, a dyno rod drain engineer was called out to a converted house in the Muswell Hill neighborhood of North London to clear a blockage. What he pulled out of the pipe was not sewage. It was human tissue. When he mentioned it, in passing, to another resident of the building, the tenant of the top-floor flat overheard the conversation from the stairwell. That tenant then walked back upstairs, drafted a written confession to 12 murders committed over the last 4 years, and handed it to the first police officer who knocked on his door. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born in Scotland in November of 1945. He had served for years in the British Army as a cook and had spent a brief period in the Metropolitan Police before settling into a long civil service post at a London job centre. To colleagues and neighbours, he was articulate, opinionated, and profoundly lonely. He lived alone in North London and spent his evenings drinking heavily in Soho pubs, where he would offer meals and a place to sleep to young men who had nowhere else to go. Between December of 1978 and January of 1983, Nielsen took the lives of at least 12 young men in his London flats, first at an address in Cricklewood, and later at the top-floor flat on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. The pattern remained consistent across all of them. He would bring a man home, offer him food, offer him shelter, and then, later in the night, strangle him. He kept the bodies in the flat for days and, in some cases, weeks afterward. He sat them in his armchair. He laid them next to him on his bed. When decomposition made further storage impossible, Nielsen dismembered the remains. At the Cricklewood address, which had a garden, he burned the bones on bonfires in the backyard, using car tires to disguise the smell. At the Cranley Gardens flat, which had no garden, he cut the remains into much smaller pieces, boiled certain parts of them in a large cooking pot on his stove, and flushed what he could down the toilet. That is what eventually caused the drain to clog. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. of the Metropolitan Police was the senior officer who arrived at Cranley Gardens on the evening of the 9th of February, 1983. He asked Nielsen where the rest of the body was. Nielsen, with almost no visible emotion, told him it was in 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe. Over the days that followed, Nielsen produced a written confession to 12 murders. He offered names where he could remember them. Many of the young men he had killed had been so socially invisible, homeless, marginalized, estranged from family, that no missing person report had ever been filed for them. Several young men who had survived encounters with Nielsen in earlier years and had reported them to police at the time had, in the era's culture of dismissiveness toward gay men, simply not been believed. Peter J. would leave the police force just 2 years later. His family later described the case as one he was, in their words, deeply bruised by. He had made it his personal mission to identify each of the young men and to give their families some form of closure, and he worked on those identifications until the end of his career. How does that many young men vanish, one at a time, from a major European capital, without a single person noticing they are gone? Nielsen was tried at the Old Bailey through October and November of 1983. He was formally convicted of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders, the cases where his defense could not effectively contest the physical evidence. His lawyers argued diminished responsibility. The jury rejected it. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. In 1994, the Home Secretary upgraded that sentence to a whole life tariff, meaning that Nielsen would never be eligible for release under any circumstance. The biographer Brian Masters, who was granted extensive access to Nielsen through interviews and correspondence over several years, produced a book about the case titled Killing for Company, which remains one of the most studied accounts of the mind of a serial murderer ever written in the English language. Dennis Nielsen died on the 12th of May, 2018, at HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire. He was 72 years old. His death was the result of complications from surgery to repair an abdominal aortic aneurysm. He had spent 35 years in prison. Several of the young men he killed have never been identified. Their descriptions, provided from Nielsen's own memory during the original interviews, remain on a Metropolitan Police cold case file to this day. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Gary Heidnik. On the 24th of March, 1987, a young woman flagged down a Philadelphia patrol car on a street in the northeast of the city, told the 2 officers she had just escaped from a basement, and asked them to please come with her because there were still 4 other women chained down there. When Philadelphia police forced open the front door of the small row house on North Marshall Street, they found a scene that would attach itself to the city's memory for the next 4 decades. On the stove, a human head was cooking in a large pot. In the freezer, they found packages labeled dog food. And in the basement, exactly as the woman had described it, 4 other women were still alive. Gary Michael Heidnik was born in November of 1943. He was a former United States Army medic with a documented history of mental illness, a prior conviction, and, unusually for the profile, an aggressive intelligence for the stock market that he had turned into a personal fortune valued at somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000. He had founded and self-ordained himself the bishop of what he called the United Church of the Ministers of God, operating it out of the same North Philadelphia row house that would later become the crime scene. To the small congregation he had attracted, he was an eccentric preacher. To 6 women he began abducting in November of 1986, he was something else entirely. Between November of 1986 and March of 1987, Heidnik took 6 black women from Philadelphia streets and imprisoned them inside a pit he had dug into the concrete floor of his basement. He held them there for weeks and months at a time. He subjected them to rape, prolonged starvation, and various forms of torture, including electric shocks. 2 of the 6 women did not survive. Sandra Lindsay, 24 years old, died from a combination of starvation and torture. Deborah Dudley, 23 years old, was electrocuted. The escape and the arrest happened almost by accident. Josefina Rivera, the first of the women Heidnik had taken, spent close to 4 months in the basement working to convince him, through what psychologists later described as a masterclass in survival persuasion, that she had become loyal to him. He eventually agreed to let her make a short, supervised visit to see her family. She got to a payphone and called the police. Officer John Cannon arrested Heidnik at a Sunoco gas station a short time later. Lieutenant James Hansen commanded the crime scene response to the house itself. The remains found inside the kitchen and the freezer were cataloged the same night. How does a self-styled bishop keep 6 women captive in a basement for months, inside a densely populated Philadelphia neighborhood, and go unnoticed by every neighbor and every congregant? Heidnik's trial began in June of 1988. His defense filed for insanity, citing his documented mental health history. The jury rejected the plea. On the 1st of July, 1988, he was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley, along with a long series of other charges, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to death. The 4 surviving women testified during the trial. The case attracted national coverage and later became one of the most cited factual sources for the fictional character Buffalo Bill in the novel and film The Silence of the Lambs. Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institution at Rockview in Pennsylvania on the 6th of July, 1999. As of 2026, he remains the last person to have been put to death by the state of Pennsylvania. His financial estate, valued in the mid-6 figures at the time of his arrest, became the subject of a long civil settlement between the surviving victims and the families of the 2 women who did not survive. Heidnik used the walls of his own home to hide what he was doing. What follows is the opposite of that. A killer who hunted openly in a specific London pub on a specific timetable he had set for himself. He is the only man on this list who studied the criteria a serial killer had to meet before choosing to become one. Colin Ireland. At the start of 1993, a 39-year-old drifter from the English seaside town of Southend sat in his rented room and drew up a list of what he called his New Year's resolutions. Losing weight was not on the list. Neither was quitting drinking. What was on his list was a single goal. He had decided that he was going to become a serial killer, using a criterion he had read in an FBI textbook, which was a minimum threshold of 5 victims. Over the following 3 months and 4 days in the West London gay pub scene, he did exactly that. Colin Ireland was born in March of 1954. He came from a dysfunctional upbringing in Southend-on-Sea and had accumulated a long record of petty offenses by his early 20s. He was unemployed at the start of 1993, had few connections to his family, and had spent months reading professional literature on the psychology of serial killers, particularly the work of the former FBI profiler Robert Ressler. Ireland was not gay himself. He selected the gay community, he later told police, because he judged the men there to be trusting and, in his own words, easy targets. Between the 8th of March and the 12th of June, 1993, Ireland took the lives of 5 gay men in London. He met each one at the Coleherne, a pub in the Earl's Court neighborhood of West London known for its clientele. He would leave with each man, travel back to that man's home, and take his life there. He carried what he called his murder kit, which consisted of rope, handcuffs, a change of clothes, and cleaning supplies to remove forensic traces from every scene. His victims were Peter Walker, a theater director, Christopher Dunn, a 37-year-old librarian, Perry Bradley III, an American businessman, Andrew Collier, a housing warden, and Emmanuel Spiteri, a 41-year-old Maltese chef. Ireland posed each body deliberately. At the 4th crime scene, after killing Andrew Collier, he also killed Collier's cat and arranged it on top of the body in a manner intended, in his own later words, to send a message. He then began telephoning newsrooms and the police directly, taunting officers with the fact of the killings and stating his intent to continue. The break in the case came from closed-circuit television. Footage recovered from Charing Cross Underground Station showed Ireland walking with Emmanuel Spiteri on the evening of the final murder. A single fingerprint left at Andrew Collier's flat was also matched to him. When Ireland was invited in for questioning, he initially admitted only to being the man in the station photograph. Days later, in August of 1993, he offered a full confession to all 5 murders. He described the killings to the detectives across the table with a calm and detached tone that senior officers on the case later said had haunted them for years afterward. In a television documentary made about the investigation, detectives described being unable to fully move past the cold, calculating detail of those confession sessions. What do you make of a man who plans his crimes by reading academic textbooks and then talks about them on tape, the same way another man might talk about paperwork? On the 20th of December, 1993, Colin Ireland appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to all 5 murders. Mr. Justice Sachs sentenced him to 5 concurrent life sentences with a whole life tariff attached. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge said that to take a single human life was an outrage, and that to take 5 was carnage, and that Ireland should never be released for any reason. Colin Ireland died on the 21st of February, 2012, at HMP Wakefield in West Yorkshire. He was 57 years old. His death was recorded as being from natural causes related to pulmonary fibrosis. He had served 19 years of his whole life tariff. In the years that followed, 3 separate broadcast documentaries revisited the case, with several of the officers involved speaking publicly for the first time about the psychological weight of interviewing him. Ireland set himself a number and stopped when he reached it. Peter Tobin never stopped. By the time detectives finally began to grasp the full scale of what he had been doing, the pattern reached back more than 15 years, ran across the length of Great Britain, and, in the words of the officer who eventually put the case together, still hid an unknown number of women who had not yet been found. Peter Tobin, In September of 2006, a young Polish woman disappeared from a church in Glasgow, Scotland, where she had been staying while working as a summer housekeeper. 5 days later, her body was found beneath the floorboards of that same church, hands bound, hidden under a plastic tarpaulin. The forensic scientist who arrived to preserve the evidence had to physically slide beneath those floorboards, in the confined dark space directly above the body, to work. And the detective who caught the case took one look at the concealment method and concluded that same afternoon that he was not looking at a first-time killer. Peter Britton Tobin was born in Scotland in August of 1946. Across a lifetime of drifting between rented rooms in Scotland, England, and Kent, he used more than 40 different aliases and had owned, at various points, over 150 different vehicles. He worked as an odd-job man. He had a long history of sexual offenses. And beneath the transient life he presented to landlords and neighbors, he had, by every later account, been quietly hunting women for decades. The 3 confirmed murders span from 1991 to 2006, and the geography is deliberate. In February of 1991, a teenage schoolgirl named Vicky Hamilton disappeared from a bus stop near Falkirk, Scotland. In August of that same year, an 18-year-old English student named Dinah McNichol disappeared after hitchhiking through Hampshire. Both young women vanished without a trace. Both bodies would eventually be found 16 years later, buried in the back garden of a house in Margate, Kent, that Tobin had rented at the time. The case that finally brought him down was Angelica Kluk, a 23-year-old language student from Dansk University who was working as a summer housekeeper at St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow. On the 24th of September, 2006, Tobin, who was working as a handyman at that church under the assumed name Pat McLaughlin, took her life inside the building. He then hid her body beneath the floorboards of the confessional area, wrapped in plastic sheeting. Detective Superintendent David Swindle of Strathclyde Police was the senior investigating officer assigned to the Kluk inquiry. Standing at the crime scene, Swindle was struck by what he later described as the sheer ferocity of the attack and the total absence of respect for human life that the concealment revealed. He concluded that same afternoon that the man he was hunting was a career serial killer whose pattern almost certainly reached back further than a single case. Out of that conclusion, Swindle built Operation Anagram, a national inquiry designed to reach back through every rented address, every employment record, and every alias in Tobin's history. The forensic scientist Carol Weston physically squeezed beneath the church floorboards to preserve evidence in place. Tobin himself had fled south to London, where he was tracked to a hospital and arrested days later. DNA quickly tied him to Kluk. Operation Anagram then produced the 2 Kent burials, which pointed directly back to Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. Swindle would later ask, publicly, how many other victims might have met Peter Tobin over the years and remained, in his phrasing, under the ground. How many people crossed the path of a man like that over the course of 40 years, and how many of them never come home? Tobin was tried 3 separate times. In 2007, at Edinburgh's High Court, he was convicted of the murder of Angelica Kluk and given a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years. In December of 2008, at Dundee High Court, he was convicted of the murder of Vicky Hamilton. In December of 2009, at Chelmsford Crown Court, he was convicted of the murder of Dinah McNichol. The cumulative effect of the 3 sentences was a whole life order, meaning that Tobin was never eligible for release under any circumstance. Peter Tobin died on the 8th of October 2022 at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. He was 76 years old. His death followed a fall inside his cell at HMP Edinburgh. No family member came forward to claim the body. He was cremated with no service, and his ashes were scattered at sea by Scottish prison authorities. A fatal accident inquiry into the circumstances of his death was formally opened in 2024. Tobin operated across decades and hid his victims beneath floorboards and inside rented gardens. Joanna Dennehy did the opposite of hiding. Within 10 days, she took the lives of 3 men, stabbed 2 more in broad daylight, laughed her way through her own arrest, and, when it was over, told a psychiatrist that she had done it because she wanted to see what it would feel like. Joanna Dennehy. In the last week of March 2013, a property developer in the small English city of Peterborough failed to arrive at a business meeting. 2 days later, his body was found dumped in a rural drainage ditch outside the city, dressed in a black sequined dress. Within the same 10-day period, 2 more men would be found in similar ditches nearby. By the time the investigation had a suspect, that suspect was almost 200 kilometers away, hunting strangers on the streets of Hereford. Joanna Christine Dennehy was born in 1982. She was raised in a middle-class family in Hertfordshire, England, and by the time she was 30, she was a mother of 2, living in the East Anglian city of Peterborough. With a long history of drug abuse and a formal diagnosis of paraphilic sadomasochism and antisocial personality disorder. She had already, by that stage, likened herself and a man she had drawn into her orbit, named Gary Stretch, to the outlaws Bonnie and Clyde. She would later tell a psychiatrist that she had killed because she wanted to see whether she was as cold as she thought she was. Between the 19th and the 29th of March, 2013, Dennehy took the lives of 3 men connected to her Peterborough social circle. Her first victim was Łukasz Slaboszewski, a 31-year-old man she had drawn into a brief relationship. Her second was John Chapman, a 56-year-old man who lived in the same house as her. Her third was Kevin Lee, a 48-year-old property developer who was both her landlord and her lover. She dumped all 3 bodies in Cambridgeshire ditches. She dressed the third victim, Kevin Lee, in a black sequined dress before disposing of him. She and Stretch then fled roughly 140 miles west to the city of Hereford, where, on the 2nd of April, 2013, she stabbed 2 random dog walkers in the street in the middle of the day. Both men, Robin Bereza and John Rogers, survived. The Hereford attacks put Dennehy's face on every national news broadcast in the country within hours. She and Stretch were arrested the same day. A friend of Dennehy who had spent time with her in the days between the murders and the flight west later testified that Dennehy had appeared, in her words, ecstatic on seeing her own face on the television news, and had jumped around the room like a schoolgirl. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Bruning, the senior investigating officer on what was internally named Operation Darcy, described Dennehy at the conclusion of the inquiry as a sadistic serial killer with a fearsome personality, and as the most dangerous woman he had ever encountered in his career. What does it take on the part of a police officer to interview a suspect who is laughing while being processed for a triple murder? In November of 2013, at the Old Bailey, Dennehy pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and to the 2 attempted murders in Hereford. She refused to allow her defense team to present any mitigating psychiatric evidence. She was formally sentenced in February of 2014 by Mr. Justice Spencer. He described her, in delivering the sentence, as a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer, and imposed a whole life order. Dennehy became one of only a very small number of women in the entire history of the United Kingdom to receive that sentence, alongside Myra Hindley and Rosemary West. In 2016, Dennehy launched a high court challenge against the conditions of her incarceration, arguing that prolonged periods of solitary confinement amounted to inhumane treatment. The court, in rejecting the challenge, described her as arguably the most dangerous female prisoner in custody in the United Kingdom. As of 2026, Joanna Dennehy is 44 years old and continues to serve her whole life sentence at HMP Bronzefield in Surrey, England's largest women's prison. Under the terms of her sentence, she is not eligible for release under any circumstance, and she will die inside the walls of the institution. She has not given any public interview since sentencing. Dennehy's spree ran for 10 days and drew a nation's attention. The final entry on this list ran on the opposite pattern. Robert Yates operated in near total silence for the better part of 2 decades on a specific stretch of road in a specific American city. And no one connected the pattern until a single traffic stop tied a family car to a body. Robert Yates. For nearly 20 years, women, most of them living on the margins of Spokane, Washington, most of them working the streets on East Sprague Avenue to support drug addictions, quietly disappeared. Their bodies would appear months later, in shallow graves in the surrounding rural counties, each one with a plastic bag tied over the head. The city knew there was a pattern. The state task force knew there was a pattern. What none of them realized until the very end of it was that the man responsible was a decorated Army helicopter pilot, a chief warrant officer with 2 decades of service, a married father of 5, and one of the more respectable-looking residents on the leafy South Hill of Spokane. Robert Lee Yates, Jr. was born in May of 1952. He served for close to 2 decades in the United States Army and the Washington National Guard, primarily as a helicopter pilot, retiring at the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 4. He had been deployed abroad on several occasions, had a chest of decorations, and had returned home each time to his wife and their 5 children on the South Hill of Spokane. To every neighbor and every co-worker, he was a quiet, respectable family man. To the sex worker community on East Sprague Avenue, he was one of the regular clients. Yates's first known murders were committed in 1975, when he was in his early 20s. His victims were a young couple, Patrick Oliver and Susan Savage, killed together in Walla Walla County, Washington. His main killing period, though, ran from 1996 to 1998. Across those 2 years, he took the lives of at least 13 women in and around Spokane, most of them sex workers he had solicited on East Sprague Avenue. His method was consistent. He would drive them to a rural area outside the city, shoot each one in the head, tie a plastic bag over the head to reduce evidence in his vehicle, and dump the body in a shallow grave. His confirmed victim total across his lifetime reached 16. One detail, uncovered late in the investigation, drew particular attention. One of his victims, Melody Murfin, had been buried in a shallow grave just outside the bedroom window of Yates's own family home, while his wife and children continued to live inside the house. Sheriff Mark Stirk of Spokane County described the resulting investigation as the largest serial murder inquiry the state of Washington had run since the Green River case a decade earlier. The break, when it came, was almost mundane. A patrol officer had noted, months earlier, that a distinctive white Corvette had been seen with a Spokane victim named Jennifer Joseph shortly before her murder. The vehicle was initially misidentified in the paperwork as a Camaro, a clerical error that delayed the connection by close to a year. When the Corvette was correctly identified and traced back to a Robert Yates registered on the South Hill, DNA and forensic evidence followed quickly. A woman named Christine Smith, who had been shot in the head by Yates in August of 1998 and who had survived, was able to provide additional identifying information. Yates was arrested in April of 2000. Court testimony during his eventual trials described physical evidence indicating that at least one of his victims had chewed through the plastic bag placed over her head before dying. How does the pattern of a killer stay invisible for close to 2 decades on a single, well-known street in an American city, when nearly every officer in the region already suspects that the pattern is there? In October of 2000, Yates entered a plea agreement in Spokane County, under which he admitted to 13 murders in exchange for the state not pursuing the death penalty on those counts. The court imposed a total sentence of 408 years in prison. That agreement, however, only covered the Spokane County cases. Pierce County, on the other side of the state, had 2 separate murders on its books. In 2002, a Pierce County jury convicted Yates of both. He was sentenced to death. His death sentence was formally commuted to life, without the possibility of parole in 2018, after the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the state's death penalty statute violated the state constitution. Capital punishment was then abolished in Washington by legislative act in 2023. As of 2026, Robert Yates is 73 years old and continues to serve his sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He is not eligible for release under any circumstance. Several of the surviving relatives of his known victims have gone on to become advocates for women in vulnerable street-based work, and their public statements over the past 2 decades have become part of the case history used in Washington state law enforcement training on serial crime pattern recognition. These 10 cases sit inside police archives for the same reason. The details never fully leave the people who worked them. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.